Okay, so the third section of today's week on this section on McDonaldization, I want to talk a little bit more generally and think about how aspects of globalization and culture itself can be viewed through this lens of McDonaldization, but also how it might be useful for bringing some other ways of thinking into this. Certainly, Ritz's work has been really influential and prominent, and is a good way of thinking about the effects of consumer culture on the wider world. But his work was very quickly kind of criticised for being, I suppose, almost homogenistic in itself, that it only really considered the way that that McDonald's may be dominating something and not really thinking too much with how people may be resisting those processes, or how McDonaldization may be coming into contact with other ways of being and doing and other systems that kind of combine that, don't necessarily totally reproduce the systems that Ritzer was talking about. So we're going to think a little bit about globalization here, homogenization, heterogeneity, then move on to the ideas of the globalization of nothing and something that Ritzer develops in response to some of this criticism later in his work. So certainly the book McDonaldization of Society was originally written in the late 80s, coming out in the early 90s. It was largely talking about American society. And then, at this time, there's a lot of work going on about globalization. And so as, Ritzer is criticized, but then also writes new editions of the book, he starts to bring in some of the kind of concepts from globalization studies and that critique into the work. And so he starts to consider, the way that globalization will both be driving processes of McDonaldization, but also there'll be forms of resistance and hybridity developing because of that dominization as well. So certainly McDonaldization in many ways can be seen as a form of Americanization in terms of the dominance of American culture throughout the globe and throughout, as globalization happened, you could probably see many elements of those kind of American cultural industries coming to dominate, and, particularly in terms of pop music and film. But, you can see this in the food industry as well. So the process of McDonaldization here in terms of that way America had a kind of disproportionate influence on consumption, how, British kids now routinely ask for fries instead of the traditional notion of the chip. There's a research example in one of his books that talks about how a Japanese kid thought McDonald's was Japanese. He didn't realize that it was actually an American company. And even in kind of more cultural stuff, where in Japan, for instance, there was centuries-old taboos about eating while standing up. And as fast food restaurants come in to dominate the landscape, that taboo has kind of largely disappeared, or at least receded to the background. So they're all good examples, I think, of the ways that McDonaldization is a way of thinking about globalization as a form of American imperialism in that sense. And as Thomas Friedman put it back in the 90s, globalization had a distinctly American face. Wears Mickey Mouse ears, eats Big Macs, drinks Coke and Pepsi, etc. So you would certainly say, McDonald's has had a bigger effect on, say, Japan than, the Japanese food chain of Mossberger's had on the US. So again, here you can see this as an economy of scale. But in reaction to this kind of Americanization, there's been a kind of critique that say, okay, certainly, that's one aspect of what's going on, and it probably is the dominant way of thinking about this. But really, there's other things going on, and there's hybrids and assemblages developing out of these globalization processes. So one of the things that Ritzer brings in is thinking about this kind of imperialism through the notion of homogenization, but then thinking about how there might be other things developing through the notion of heterogenization, where heterogenization is this kind of notion of combining multiple things from multiple areas to create something new. And so there's tensions going on here between homogenization and heterogenization. So again, homogenization is just that American imperialism of where American culture can be seen to dominate. But there's other things going on here. So in terms of, as cultures become more combined and hybrid, Thai boxing by Moroccan girls in Amsterdam, and, Irish bagels and Chinese tacos and these kind of things. You can see maybe the popularity of, various forms of takeaway in places like Australia, and the rituals around late night curries in the UK in particular. Now, there's certainly kind of cultural, imperial and domination things going on when those things happen, but there's also a kind of wider hybridity of food practices being developed when those things happen. So we can see here these notions of bricolage where, these spaces can be used for things beyond the dominant hegemony. And a good example that Kellner points out is that when he went to a McDonald's in Taiwan, he saw that the place was packed with students, there's kids studying there, young people hanging out and couples coupling, where in Australia and America, you can't really do that in McDonald's. You kind of seen as loitering, and people that just are hanging around that aren't consuming are often kicked out of those spaces by security guards. So there you can see in Taiwan, this Americanized, McDonaldized space is kind of used differently than it is in places like Australia and the US. You can see here maybe the opposite direction as well, how these kind of American institutions adapt the local cuisine in their menus as well. So there was, in the 90s, the McOz was invented. It was actually invented at Cessnock McDonald's, and became a thing all around Australia. So there's both going on here at once. So you can certainly talk about how there's cultural dominations, but there's this kind of heterogenization going as well. And this is reflected in the term globalization. The idea that this kind of, there's an interplay between global forces and the local, and this produces these kind of hybrid and assemblage kind of new forms of popular culture and consumer culture in particular. There's standardization and homogenization going on, but there's also variety, diversity, and novelty happening as well. So you can certainly think about the positives and negatives in terms of scale, in terms of what's lost, and certainly in terms of the kind of global environmental effects. But we need to move beyond just this kind of dominance of kind of American culture and think about what else is happening here as well. So one of the things that Ritzer started to develop, he developed a new way of thinking about this. He started talking about what he saw as the globalization of nothing as a way of kind of bringing in some of these critiques. And that he argued that we need to think about, this interplay between what he calls the globalization, that interplay between the global and the local, and what he calls the globalization, which is the dominance of kind of these huge multinational corporations that promote their own kind of way of life and being that may be American and maybe European, but that tends to kind of drive organic cultures away. So he wants us to think about how in this process, as McDonaldization and globalization intertwine, that what this means is there's this globalization of nothing. There's a dominance of what he calls non-places, non-things, non-people, and non-services. And there's 5 different dimensions to this. There's complexity, where previously there was unique spaces, now they're more generic. There's the spatial, where things happen with local geographic ties, and now much consumption through globalization is done through a lack of social ties, through import and export. There's temporal things where, a particular consumption practice would be tied to a specific time and place. And now as we can, go to the mall pretty much 7 days a week or, buy online, our consumption is much time free. There's the human, as I've said already, these processes dehumanize. And there's this magical element, the idea that as these systems come to dominate, the world becomes more disenchanted in that sense. So I don't know, you could think through that through, say, playing off an example of, say, a local market and, going to the shopping mall. Local markets tend to have things that are quite unique or, locally made by a specific local artist. They'll have the ties to that local area. They'll happen at a specific time, from 8 till 12 on a Saturday morning. There'll be a time where you can stand there and talk to the artist or talk to the farmer about, how this year's crops were, or what the artist means with a particular thing you might be buying. And for Ritz's point of view, this means we had this kind of enchanted, almost spiritual relationship between people and things. On the other side of the scale, there's this kind of generic thing where if you go to the mall, pretty much everything's the same. There's the same shops at the same malls all over the world. Things are produced often in sweatshops in the third world and shipped over there. So there's no lack of, there's a lack with local ties and local production. As I said, you can pretty much consume 24/7, whether through the internet or, the mall's open 7 days a week. And then again, these processes as people in the shops have got to stick to a script and got to upsell you and all this kind of stuff, sees the experience dehumanized and disenchanted. So Ritzer wants us to think about this relationship. He kind of brings in this kind of notion that there's this kind of hybridity and stuff going on, but he wants us to be reminded that there's a dominant process going on here. This is what he kind of interestingly calls globalization. And he's relating growth here to kind of that notion of gross domestic product, the idea that companies constantly have to grow and raise their profit to be successful. And this means that there's kind of these imperialistic ambitions of these corporations to impose themselves all over the world. For Ritzer, it would be better if globalization was the thing that dominated, that as these kind of global and local forces came together, there was a kind of even share of influence. But he argues that it's the globalization thing that's dominating, that it's it's a kind of sheer scale of these things are the things that are dominating. So to relate to this, he points out that what happens here is there's this growth of the experience of nothing. And by nothing, he's using this metaphorically here, that these experiences around the world basically is the globalization of nothing, in the sense that all these homogenous things that this system produces become to dominate, those McDonaldized things, and the notion of something, that kind of enchanted humanistic experience, is the thing that is replaced. So again, there's a dichotomy here. He wants us to think about what all this means. Do we want something or do we want nothing? I don't know, I was thinking about this and maybe the rise of hipster culture and the obsession with, the authentic and the organic and the ornate and that kind of thing. Maybe in our contemporary times, a return to kind of wanting something over the mass-produced nothing. So in Ritzer's Globalization of Nothing book, he kind of has these figures where he kind of positions various texts and experiences and things on these kind of trajectories between something and nothing and the global and the global. So I've just put these in there for you to have a look at, to kind of think about this stuff, in terms of, different non-places or things, places, things, non-places, that kind of stuff, where he maps these things out in terms of what he argues where they sit on these trajectories. So just you can have a look at that yourself. For Ritzer, again, the globalization of nothing and the dominance of McDonaldization systems see the growth of non-places, non-things, non-people, and non-services dominate consumer culture. Now, we can consume and participate outside of these things, but on the sheer scale, the economy of scale here, these are the things that dominate consumption. So in non-places are things like McDonald's, Starbucks, shopping malls, supermarkets, airports. By non-places, he's relating to the French anthropologist work here of Marc Aug, who wrote a really interesting book called Non-Places. And the idea of non-places here is essentially they're identical, no matter where you're in the world. There's non-things, again, pretty much all brand name products that are exactly the same no matter where you consume them. There's non-people, again, this false friendliness, people that are kind of in these service industries forced to negotiate with each other through scripts and false friendliness. And there's non-services, drive-thrus, credit cards, self-serve photos, ATMs, which really aren't really services. It means that we're doing the work, the consumer does the work. So these are the systems that Ritzer wants us to think as dominating. And there's a relationship here. He says there's a zero-sum game going on here, that as there's an increase in the dominance of nothing, there's a decrease in something. So as large supermarkets come to dominate the way we get our groceries, local businesses like the butcher and greengrocer close. And what this also means is there's a decrease in something in terms of that human relationship, where you might have known the butcher and he knows you like your meat cut a certain way, or you go to the greengrocer and they know that you want to buy, these apples and these bananas, and sometimes they may have already had the bad bag ready for you. Today we go and, pick all that stuff up ourselves through the supermarket aisles. Sure, we're choosing and all that kind of stuff, but for the Ritzer's analysis here, we lose something as well. Same here with the kind of rise of fast food restaurants. They obviously having links to obesity and stuff like that, but often the food is just bad, right? It's just sloppy and that kind of thing. Certainly in terms of the decrease in something as well, that in these McDonaldized systems, quite often workers aren't experts in what they sell. and it's you can't necessarily go into Bunnings now and get really specific advice about what you're trying to do at home, as you maybe could have with the place where the smaller places in advance. Certainly you can book in and maybe do a DIY course or something, but again, that kind of everyday activity and everyday relationship, something's missing there. So here, the more nothing we have, again, the more things are meant to be boring, the same, the less we relate to each other, and the less notion of local community is threatened. So in terms of resistance, I've just put this in here just to have a look at, just try and not be too depressed about all this kind of stuff, because like Weber, Ritzer doesn't have a lot of positivity in terms of what's going to happen in the future. You'll just see, he argues that these things will become more and more dominant, and he kind of plays some round with Weber's idea of the iron cage here, and points out some kind of futures. He says maybe that the iron cage is a velvet cage, that we'll be that comfortable within it, that we'll kind of keep craving it, I suppose, that we'll crave the processes, and that will become a self-fulfilling prophecy, I suppose. Maybe, in that velvet cage, we'll see nothing wrong with everything being more predictable and more the same. And as things become more predictable and the same, we'll crave those things more and more. Ritzer argues that this is kind of happening now, that this is kind of the dominant logic of consumer culture, and that it's kind of a standstill. There's not much happening, but it feels like there's lots of movement going on. But others, maybe there's the rubber cage where we'll be able to escape it every now and then. And so we can maybe, when you get out of a city and go and camping somewhere where, you can escape this kind of stuff, and the kind of pressures to be busy and to do things quickly and to be constantly consuming may be possible to escape every now and then. And others, he kind of argues that maybe this, the third type may be just like Weber talks about with the iron cage. So he also points to different political movements that are engaging with this, the slow food movement, certainly the consumer movements around the so-called anti-globalization movement of late 90s and early 2000s that developed around no logo, and maybe the kind of when people pursue like high-risk activities like, taking lots of drugs, or, getting really drunk, or, jumping off things, driving fast, going skiing and all that kind of stuff, or, surfing big waves, or those kind of risk experience might be good examples of where people are trying to escape these kind of iron cage and homogenous experiences. Another kind of way of maybe resisting this is what Brian S. Turner has called ironic consumption. And maybe we reflexively understand that we live in this McDonaldized society, and maybe even if we reflexively understand that there's no escape, that this means that there's an ironic disposition that may be developed where people can kind of participate in this stuff with a knowing kind of nudge, nudge, wink, wink kind of thing, and just kind of enjoy it anyway, get on with it, and not get too alienated from those experiences as a kind of form of everyday resistance. Okay, so I just want to kind of finish there in terms of today's content. So just to sum up, McDonaldization has been a really important way of thinking about consumer culture in terms of the way that we're kind of consumers in many facets of our lives now, not just in terms of what we eat and drink, and not just in terms of what we consume in terms of pop culture, that now in fields of like education and health and all other facets of our lives, we're increasingly treated as a consumer. I think this has been particularly useful to think about the way that globalization has been, a form of cultural imperialism in many senses, but there's also ways of, rises of hybrid and bricolage kind of notions that are forms of the ways that cultures develop and change over time, and also produce moments of resistance and subversion as well, hopefully. In the last part, I wanted to touch upon Ritzer's reaction to that and talk about this idea of globalization of nothing, and how Ritzer argues there's kind of a playoff between, as these things dominate, the more nothing we have in that metaphorical sense, the less of something we have, and the less opportunity there'll be for us to be creative, to live spontaneously, and have creative and kind of emotional and spiritually kind of interesting human relations. Okay, thanks.